Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Grow Sanctuary podcast. In this episode, I interviewed Sebastian Coello, who is an exercise scientist based in Sydney, Australia. We discussed a wide range of topics, including functional patterns, the gait cycle, human biomechanics, how you can use functional patterns to improve the way you walk, run, throw, perform in all of your life's activities. We touched on the negative health effects of activities such as the deadlift and yoga. We talked about natural footwear, the issues with traditional orthotics, and we also touched on some practical advice for replacements for static or passive stretching that a lot of people do before and after sports. So Sebastian gives some options for replacing those bad habits. It's a very informative episode. We cover a lot. I hope you get some value out of it. Enjoy the show. Go. Hello, Sebastian, and welcome to the show.
Hey.
So Sebastian's calling from Sydney. I'm in New Zealand, and we're going to discuss functional patterns, training, staying healthy, a lot of other topics. We'll see how much we can get done in a short amount of time. So first question to get us started is, what is functional patterns training, and how do you utilize that in your personal training business and your rehabilitation business?
Yeah, absolutely. So functional patterns is a training methodology that was created, say, around 10 years ago. The focus is more on, training according to, how we evolved, which is basically the way we ran, walked, and throwed. Okay, so, those three movements as like the primary movements that we did basically as we evolved, right? Whether it was hunting, whether it was, going to chase animals, whatever it was, we sort of mainly, even in general exercise, did those three movements the most, right? So how I've incorporated now functional patterns for around the last 4 years, predominantly. And that has sort of basically changed my entire approach to training, which was, before I used to sort of focus on more isolated movements, more bodybuilding type of training. But then, using functional patterns, it's such a sort of integrative training. I sort of left everything behind and started using that more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess you would have started, was it late 2016-ish or?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that was about when late 2016 was when I first went and trained up in Auckland, did a couple of sessions. It was really good. So you said that running, walking, and throwing. So those are obviously the three main movements, and throwing is for like obviously spears and stuff like that, I guess, hunting.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
what would
absolutely.
be the fourth? What would be the fourth one? Is there an idea on that? Like striking, maybe, or?
Yeah, well, look, with those three being the foundation, there are obviously other movements that come from that, whether it be, say, for example, as you said, striking, absolutely, the same sort of, when we talk about the running, the throwing, and the walking, we're talking more about sequences of movement, right? So I'll give you an example, say, for example, boxing, you have an element of running, an element of walking, but also, as you said, striking, right? So that the striking more relates to the running and the walking, in the sense that, we move in opposites. So for example, this term called contralateral reciprocation. So say your left arm moves with your right leg. And these patterns of movement occur, in pretty much all sports, whether maybe not exactly rowing, but even that has an element of sort of movement that we've done prior. So I'd sort of say that, even say, there are, such as crawling is an example, all these movements that, even though they seem like they don't relate, they still have sort of relations in terms of the way the muscles are contracted and the way they're used in movement, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, that does make sense. And another one of the kind of words that I hear when I'm learning about functional patterns, I watch a lot of so much good content on Instagram and YouTube, so much great free content. Everyone should
Yeah, they
check
have
it
a lot
out.
there.
Slings and fascia. Could you talk a wee bit about those two concepts?
Yeah. So now we're going a little bit deeper into what exactly happens when we're doing, like, when we're moving in general. So slings, the term slings has sort of been chatted around, the mixed martial arts sort of community, as well as in general, the throwing community as well, whether it be, the javelin throwers, whether it be, and now we're talking about martial arts, the boxing. So slings refers to the motion that is basically that the opposite forces that occur during movement. So a sling would occur, for example, the primary sling in the body is the obliques. So, for example, you've got the internal and external oblique on the core. And what these slings how these slings sort of work is they work, in a way that sort of assist movement in rotation. So rotation is pretty much, if we're talking about human movement, rotation is one of the primary sort of rotation is probably one of the primary motions that occur in comparison to, say, our chimp ancestors or anything. They work in a more sort of rigid fashion, but slings sort of refers to how the rotation of the core, the trunk, the way we walk, the way we run, it all revolves around basically our core of our body, and how this relates to fascia is the connective tissue between, say, the skin, the upper layer of the skin, and the muscles. So it's this, long connective tissue that pretty much wraps around the whole body, right? And fascia has sort of been neglected for many years in the medical community, but it's sort of now only being recognized as such an important sort of organ, actually, now that it's recognized, and the function of fascia is so much more, there's many more functions in fascia that we found that we sort of didn't really realize. An example of that is there are more nerves, funny enough, in fascia than there are in muscles. So the implications of this is, say, for example, in terms of pain, whether you're dealing with someone in chronic pain, in their daily life, they're walking and they get lower back pain and things like this. It doesn't always have to relate to, say, the lower back muscles. It could actually relate to the way your fascia is working and all that. So only now has it sort of been, recognized in the medical field,
Yeah. That's a good comprehensive answer. And on that fascia subject,
Yep.
I did do yoga for a little bit in 2013. I did the
Right.
Bikram yoga, and
Nice.
I was glad that I never actually did any of the poses or anything like seriously. I just enjoyed the sweat, basically, the
Yep.
detoxification, because I didn't
Yep.
know about far infrared saunas back then.
Right.
And I'm really thankful I didn't do the yoga properly, because
Right.
I've heard that if you do yoga properly for a long time, you're sort of screwing up the fascia by kind of like, as if it was a rubber band, you're stretching it and it's just
Yes.
staying stretched. Is that
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. I mean, fascia, the way fascia works, similar to what you're talking about with the slings, they work in sort of elastically, right? So things in the human body is meant to move in an elastic fashion. So if you think about, give you the example between a stiff tree and a tree that bends, if you look at the force, if you put a high amount of force on that hard tree, that it's going to snap around the weakest link, right? But if you found sort of like a tree or like a plant, like the bamboo shoot, for example, it sort of bends, but it sort of absorbs the force. So slings and the way we sort of evolve fascia as well responds like that. So it responds elastically to absorb the force that occurs during movement in a way that sort of allows you to use that force in the rest of your movement. I'll give you an example. Say you're running and your foot strikes the ground. we want to be able to have a healthy fascia and healthy movement so that you're able to absorb the force from the ground and transfer it onto the next step, right? So the problem with, say, things like yoga is that when we're holding these stretches, typically what you do in yoga is, holding these stretches for periods of time and holding them in, I guess, poses that aren't necessarily related to how we move in general. What you're asking your fascia to do is sort of lengthen, but without that contractile component, which is that recoil in the fascia, right? So say you go, you did an hour of yoga where you're full on stretching the fascia and you're, disintegrating it in a way from its elastic potential. You're not going to be able to run as efficiently because you basically just told your muscle to tear and not really absorb the force anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When I was in high school, I did a lot of basketball training, and
Right.
I was lucky. I guess the online coach that I was following at that time, he did mention how dynamic stretching is better before exercise and passive
Yes.
stretching for afterwards. So the shorter stretches before and long stretches afterwards. But you would say, I think, well, what I've learned from functional patterns in the last couple of years is that even passive stretching, so obviously yoga, we know there's the problems there, but passive stretching as well, not very important, or even it could be damaging?
Yeah, so in a way, yoga replicates passive stretching, or otherwise known as
It's just a more extreme
static
version.
stretching. Static stretching, exactly right. Yeah, so if you look at say static stretching on a fascial level, so on a cellular level, whenever you passively stretch a muscle for say more than 30 seconds at a time, what's actually occurring at the muscle fiber level and at the fascial level is small micro tears, right? So these small micro tears, what they're doing is basically, in a way, passive stretching or otherwise known as static stretching is used in a way to increase flexibility, right? But that flexibility is only occurring via the tearing of that fascia and muscle fiber. But if you look at what we want to do, say, I'll give you an example of the basketball. We want to be able to run and change direction as quickly as possible, right? But that cannot happen. So those movements of changing direction as fast as possible require high force movements. Do you know what I mean? So if you're tearing a muscle at the cellular level, what you're doing is you're decreasing that ability for the fascia and the muscle to absorb that force and transfer it. Right? It's almost getting stuck, or you're just not going to be able to produce the same amount of force. I'll give you an example for myself. I used to train during soccer. Just before a football game, I used to do a lot of static stretching, right? And there was one game where I remember feeling quite, tight around my hip flexors and my glutes. So what I decided to do was, take half an hour of time before my game to do a lot of passive static stretching, right? But what I'd end up doing was exactly what I just said, causing these small little micro tears. And for the entire first half of the game, I couldn't run at fast at all. So I was almost working at 2 times slower pace, and I just couldn't understand what was going on. I took electrolytes. I had even a bit of caffeine before the game just because I wasn't feeling up for it. And then it was only after, say, the 45th minute when my muscles started to wake up a little bit, that blood flow started getting in, or I was able to actually run, right? But then I sort of intuitively knew that from a young age at 14 that I didn't want to do stretching before a game because I didn't feel the benefits from it. So that's where the whole argument between static stretching and dynamic comes in, where dynamic, you're trying to replicate the muscle contractions that are occurring in whatever activity you're about to partake in. But static stretching sort of doesn't actually replicate that, if that makes sense. So you're almost weakening the fascia just before you do that activity.
Yeah, it's like you're kind of destroying the muscle's ability to have that recoil spring, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, that at the end of the day, what the difference between a good mover and a bad mover is your ability to sort of deal with those forces, So being efficient at using the force, say, for example, I'm going to shoulder charge someone in soccer. If I don't have that ability to sort of spring back, I'm just going to fall down, So without having that ability, absolutely, your ability to recoil from activities is going to be way worse. And if you're talking about injury risk, that's where the worst can come in, So if I've just done a bunch of stretching before an activity, and then I go do something like a soccer kick, which is a high force open chain activity, and open chain meaning with one leg on the ground and the other in the air, sort of without any support, then my risk for injury goes way up, because what I'm doing is I'm basically producing this high force movement with very little, with nothing really stopping my leg from continuing to go forward. And there I can potentially rip a hamstring, or, in this case, a fascial sort of line.
Cool. Yeah. And so say someone's listening to this and
Yep.
they don't know anything about functional patterns except what
Yep.
they've heard so far today, and tomorrow morning they've got a sports match or something.
Yep.
What would you say maybe they could try doing before and after, or not doing before and after?
Yeah, absolutely. So when any athlete trains with a functional patterns practitioner, basically what the functional patterns practitioner will try and do is optimize the movements and the forces that are occurring in that sport, right? So say, for example, the perfect example of a wrestler, right? If a wrestler won't necessarily be sprinting all that much, right? So why go for some sprints before a game? What you'd want to do is you'd want to replicate exactly those forces that are going on. So say, for example, we'll bring the most common sport, right? Football as an example, right? The primary movements that you're going to do would be kicking, some lateral stepping, and sprinting, right? So rather than doing a passive activity or a passive stretch, what you'd want to be doing is you'd want to be slowly and incrementally increasing the intensity at which you run in a warm-up, for example. So you'd start slow, get the blood flow to the fascia, get the blood flow to the muscles, and then slowly start to increase the intensity of that running, right? So sort of getting to the point where you're able to run at 100%. Because you never really want to go into any activity where you haven't really done the actual movements that you're about to do in that sport or activity completely cold. That's another risk for injury. But the more you do these types of training where you're trying to replicate exactly what's going on in the sport, the less actual warm up you actually need, right? Because your body's already adapted to that movement. So what you could do, for example, is again with soccer, practicing a couple kicks where you're really trying to replicate exactly whether it's the hip motion, the foot, different types of kicks. And then once you sort of get the fascia moving in that elastic sort of way, that's when you can sort of transfer it to the sport. So you're starting warm up and you're almost ready to go because you've already practiced those movements. Another thing I'd avoid is just really not focusing on apart from the passive stretching, not doing anything that has any elasticity in it. So you need to be doing an activity prior to, say, I'll give you again football as an example. You need to be doing something with bounding, something where there's a ballistic force to replicate the recoil. Or else, if you've just gone from sitting in the car for 6 hours and then just sprinted, you know what I mean? Unless you've actually done those movements in your training during the week, that's a recipe for an injury straight away. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And post match, no, it still wouldn't be advisable to do a ton of static stretching at all, would it?
No, absolutely not. Because again, you're tearing those muscles where we want to maintain that elasticity. At the end of the day, the most important things that you could do to optimize your elasticity is actually making sure there aren't any fascial adhesions or otherwise known as fascial knots, right? A lot of people when they have a knot in their back underneath their shoulder blade after a long day at work or something, and they sort of want to get a massage or something. There's a reason you want to get a massage. It's because all those nerves and blood flow sort of compress in that one area, right? But what we're told to do is sort of stretch, right, to sort of alleviate that. But stretching is only a superficial approach to the issue, right? It's almost like tying a knot together and then pulling on both ends of the knot, right, and just tightening the knot from in the middle, right? But how you have to address the knot is undoing the knot from the middle, and then you can pull the string, right? That way you're actually able to address the actual point of tension, right? So, this method is called, myofascial release, which is basically releasing those fascial adhesions from the area which, they may be too contracted. Most common in people is, underneath the shoulder blades, around the chest area where they've got a lot of shoulder tightness, especially those sports. I'll give you an example of basketball. The tighter your shoulders are, or the more fascial adhesions you have, the harder your ability to actually shoot or anything in general, because your arms are going to be, and your shoulders are going to be quite stiff at the front, right? So your ability to really open up those arms behind the head and get that ball, to be able to shoot it, depends on the ability for your shoulder to be elastic and free of adhesion. So doing myofascial release is a way better approach than passive stretching for that reason, because it doesn't actually tear the muscle in any way. It actually prepares the muscle to be more elastic after, because now you've got more of a streamlined ability to contract the muscle, right? Whereas before you sort of had these points of tension that were stopping the muscle from fully contracting. Hopefully that sort of makes a little bit more sense than just a passive approach.
Yeah. I think that's definitely good practical information for people. The nowadays videos on myofascial release, MFR, were pretty. I think that was what I first found out about from FP on YouTube, was lacrosse ball for the IT band, and it made such a huge difference to, like, all over the body. You could feel differences, and that's, attests to that point of the fascia being like one sheath with many muscles inside, right? It's all connected.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it was, we've known for years and years now that the existence of fascia, right, within the body as one sort of sheath underneath, one interconnected sort of organ, right? As I said before, with the entire nervous system being ingrained in it. And, every time we move, we're not actually just moving, one part of the fascia. When we move one limb, we're actually sort of moving the whole fascia together, if that makes sense. So we sort of, the traditional route of the medical system in regards to, so, looking at cadavers to understand the human body, what we've actually done is we've cut the layer of the skin and gone straight through the fascia all the way to the muscle, right? But by going through the fascia, we've sort of missed,
You should probably tell the audience what the cadavers are.
Yeah.
So, because people probably don't know.
Yeah. So absolutely, yeah. So cadavers are sort of, dead bodies, basically, in a way, and people, the surgeons and stuff, in regards to finding out more about the human body in the past, going through these dead bodies. I mean, even Da Vinci back in the day was doing it, to sort of understand human anatomy. And he found this layer called the fascia. They call it something different in Latin, of course, but that they found that it was sort of been almost forgotten, and we've sort of come back to it now, realizing its sort of potential. So there's a system out there, called Anatomy Trains, which has sort of identified these lines of fascia and the importance of fascia in sort of human movement. So there are several lines of fascia that sort of replicate the movements that we have sort of done over our evolution. So for example, there's this line of fascia that connects the two ends of the obliques. There's a line of fascia that connects the entire outside of the body. Okay, so these show how fascia is not just, you can't just identify fascia from one isolated area. When you look at fascia, you have to look at how the system as a whole moves with the fascia, if that sort of clarifies something.
Yeah, it's a holistic approach to the whole body.
Yeah.
I think MFR, myofascial release, is a great thing for people just to get started with, like right now. Like when they finish the podcast, they can literally find a tennis ball and get started, and look up functional patterns MFR videos on YouTube. But pretty soon you have to, from what I understand and from my own experience, you have to address the gait cycle, right? Because if you're just loosening up your sore muscles or undoing the knots, you've got to retrain them, right? So could you talk about that, the retraining?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, if you've got an understanding of where you sort of feel those fascial adhesions, you come to understand certain patterns and in terms of pain. So for example, on a weekly basis, you might go, right, okay, this whole week I've gotten, heaps of lower back pain. My right calf and both the bottom of my feet kill after a day of work, right? So you can sort of start seeing patterns as to when this pain starts to come on, and through myofascial release is an awesome tool to sort of alleviate that pain, right? So alleviate those fascial adhesions and get the fascia flowing together, in terms of getting the blood flow in and out of the fascial sheath without any restrictions, which in at the end of the day is sort of great for your health, right? So if you get more blood flow and more lymph flow through that fascia, your ability to detoxify toxins in your body, it's all going to be better, right? But at the end of the day, once you've sort of relieved these adhesions, there are certain biomechanical, ways that you've sort of walking and running, which is, as you referred to before, as a gait cycle, that are causing these adhesions. I'll give you a perfect example with myself. Back in 2013, I had a double fracture of my tibia and fibula, which is just around the calf area. And that basically I was immobilized for about a year, where I was on crutches. I was sort of walking around, and I started to use, obviously, my left leg that was on the ground a lot more than my right. My right didn't really have any force going in it because I couldn't really put it on the ground, right? And then after that year, I had to get another operation to get that sort of plate that they originally put in to sort of straighten up everything out, right? But what ended up happening was the way I walked and the way I ran completely changed, because I didn't have that muscular force that I had to start off with in the right leg. I had to sort of walk my way around not feeling the pain that I was feeling in my hips. So certain muscles that shouldn't be activated when I'm walking started to activate. And, I went through all this pain and stuff. And that's when I sort of had found myofascial release through a physiotherapist that had helped me with that. And he had sort of released certain muscles. But, unfortunately, he didn't really understand that, once you release those tissues, there were certain patterns of my walking that continued to cause those adhesions, right? So this is where sort of prehabbing may have come in a bit helpful, prehabbing and rehabbing these patterns of walking and running that to completely prevent these from occurring in the first place, So that's where, you do need sort of like a functional patterns practitioner or someone to really look at your gait cycle and really analyze where in your walking and running is something out of position or out of line or out of sync with the rest of the body, right? And through identifying that and correcting it, your walking and running becomes much more efficient, and you don't end up getting these fascial adhesions because everything is in sync with itself, So, in nature, most things that function well are quite symmetrical, right? In general, whether you want to call it the golden ratio or whatever, there are things that when the body works in symmetry, you don't get these asymmetrical adaptations, right? But asymmetrical adaptations in walking and running can cause a havoc on the body, especially when it comes to high force activities like running. That's where things tend to go quite bad.
Yeah. I have done the, with you and with other FP practitioners, the gait cycle, getting, sprinting on a treadmill and getting someone to film it in slow motion, because that's what you need. You can't do this without slow motion, because it's not just asymmetries you're looking for. You're also looking for other deficiencies like arm positioning, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, so I guess this comes down to what makes a good gait cycle, right? Why would we look at one gait cycle and then another, but be able to see how the common denominators, the common similarities that you're meant to have that are meant to produce those results, right? So slowing down a gait cycle allows you to sort of see not only symmetry in one arm and the other leg and the other. It's more just understanding joint positioning, the way what we spoke about earlier in the podcast regarding, absorbing force from the ground, that elastic recoil. Do you have that elastic recoil? Do you have that ability to absorb the force from the ground without your joints doing any deviations, without your hips compensating in positions that aren't meant to occur? So this is where slowing everything down and understanding what body limbs, for example, the arms are meant to come first. When should the trunk rotate? When should the legs come forward with the opposite arm? That's where looking at the gait cycle is super important to be slowed down. And through that, we're able to see and understand where you're compensating, where your dysfunctions are. But once we've identified this, the hard work now comes in. How do we optimize that? How do we better that? And it's through looking at expert movers, whether it be people the best in their field, whether it be Usain Bolt for sprinting, whether it be Barry Sanders in the NFL, whether it be Benji Marshall in Australian rugby. Looking at these top movers, they all have similarities in their movement that are optimal for running, at the end of the day. And if you look at their injury history, a lot of them don't really have these injuries related to gait in the first place because of how efficient they are. Commonly, say, for example, Barry Sanders, these, at the end of the day, you can't control for things like, people tackling you from the back of the legs, right? You can't really control for those things. But when it comes to your own movement, these are things that are within your control, that you're not completely uncontrolled for, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you're doing these slow motion recording or just, your own visual analysis of someone's gait cycle, so they're running sprinting ideally on the treadmill, it also has to be barefoot, doesn't it? Because you want to be able to see ankles, and there's problems there, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of discussion within the fitness industry regarding, whether, wearing shoes, the benefits, the detriments, why you can develop certain patterns of dysfunctional movement through wearing shoes. And there's a lot of debate within the fitness industry regarding that. But the reason you want to be doing primarily anything related to, especially in analysis, right, in terms of the human body, you want to do it as natural as possible. And as natural as possible is how we evolved, right, to be barefoot. The trend that of the last 50 years of everyone getting a different pair of shoes every week, or every month, has sort of seen a massive degeneration of our ability to use our feet, in general. Because at the end of the day, what shoes do is almost act like a plaster right around the foot. You can't really feel the ground. You can't. And that actually alters your movement. So say, for example, you're on the treadmill and you were running and you had a pair of shoes on, especially with a large heel at the bottom. Basically what's going on is that heel on the bottom is actually altering the way the rest of your body is moving, because now that high heel is elevating your natural heel positioning when you're striking the ground. And thus your knee is responding to that because it's a next point on the kinetic chain, and then your hips are responding to your knee, and then your shoulders responding to your hips. So you can see how basically what happens from below affects what's going on up above. So that's where you start seeing how holistic and how integrative movement is. You can't just look at one thing and go, all right, we can focus on that and improve that. We have to sort of address everything all at once. So I mean, ideally, being natural, being barefoot, will allow for the most raw evidence of your movement in that moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think one of the things, though, that kind of, just to point out, this isn't a question, that kind of a little bit frustrating to see in the fitness and health industry is people who are just kind of selling this idea of primal movement, and we're outside and we're in bare feet, therefore it's good. That, you know what I mean? Like, they're not actually taking it to the next level. Taking off your shoes alone isn't going to change your movement patterns much at all. Yeah, it is good for grounding. You're getting the benefits of being in nature. That's great, but to sell that as a way to help people prevent injuries is just incorrect. And I see huge accounts dedicated to that sort of idea, and it's kind of sad. And I wish that attention would be given to functional patterns, and that's why I'm doing this podcast, to get the word out, because you guys have such a great system. My next question was, this might be a little bit too complicated to do just in this podcast, but traditional orthotics, because I had them for about 7 years, and they were different. The right one had more arch support than the left one, so that was
Yes.
creating asymmetries in my body, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were given orthotics probably in the first place because of the asymmetries present, right? And what those orthotics tried to do is, or I mean, I guess the person giving you those orthotics, right? What he tried to do is sort of see if he can correct those asymmetries by simply replacing, or I guess altering the way your foot is, responding to the way you strike the ground, right? Unfortunately, what happens with that is that doesn't address the underlying issue, which was why you're walking that way. This is similar to what you were saying with the whole primal movement stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, you could just take off your shoes and start to get benefit, especially around your ankles and your feet, which at the end of the day, you've got all these little muscles and ligaments and tendons that are in your ankle and feet that are responsible for, how strong you are and the balance and all that. So that's great. But hello, there's so much more to the body than just the feet, So, perhaps it was like a structural hip issue that was going on that was altering the way you were striking the ground. These things have to be taken into account before you give someone something like an orthotics, because orthotics, again, similar to what I was giving you, the analogy of the shoe in regards to not actually being able to feel the ground when you strike the ground, orthotics are stopping your ability for your foot to naturally feel the ground at the end of the day as well. So what you're doing is just by changing the way your foot strikes the ground with the orthotic positioning, you're changing the way the rest of your joints respond to that force on the ground as well. So, if you've got asymmetrical feet, now you've got asymmetrical knees and asymmetrical hips and asymmetrical shoulders just by changing what's going on down below,
Yeah.
So, there are many practitioners who within FP have, also been given orthotics in the past, and just by removing those orthotics and learning to be training, according to their gait cycle and, according to their human movement, barefoot as an example, aligning the rest of the body with that, that's when they've gotten the biggest benefit. It's unfortunate that, we've got this, Band-Aid approach to human movement nowadays where, a kid is given a foot analysis scan and they've revealed he's got flat feet. So now they're going to be giving him orthotics because he's got flat feet. But why has he got flat feet? Perhaps he's never used his feet in his life. Perhaps he's always had shoes on, as an example. Perhaps he's never been barefoot and never actually moved in a fashion that's, moving outside, the typical standing, sitting, and, going to school, really. You see this massive sort of movement in both directions, really. I think in the future, orthotics are going to be completely irrelevant unless there is a legitimate reason for using them, such as, unless you have a general joint dysmorphia or something that's going on at the actual joint that you can't actually even put the foot on the ground properly,
Yeah. I can totally relate to what you're saying about the person not using, or the child maybe not using their feet and therefore developing flat feet. Because I did martial arts all through my childhood, and then I sort of transitioned to a lot of sports. But when I was doing martial arts, it was always barefoot indoors and like on wooden floor. And I never had sore feet or needed the orthotics. The need for orthotics started sometime around when I started doing a lot of sports using, and a lot of running using shoes, activity in shoes. Maybe that's something to do with what brought that about. But
could be.
On that topic, have you heard of the products where the toe spreader type products?
Such as the clear toes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know that brand, but there's a mixture of them. Like some of them are wooden, and you've got to, obviously you can't move in those, and then there's others where they're like silicone, and you can walk around in them, and you can fit them in your shoes and stuff. Do you think they're a good start for people to help with their foot and movement?
Yeah, I mean, the shape of the modern shoe, right, is funny enough completely different to how the feet actually evolved, right? So if you look at the top if you look at the ball of the foot, or the top of where the toes are, basically, you look at most modern shoes, they go to a point, right? So it's almost like the top end of the shoe, all the toes are squashed together, and you've got this point where you're meant to strike the ground, almost like a heel, right, for women. But the issue is we evolved to have our toes spread out, right, along with the ball of our foot spread out, so the muscles are able to get the maximum amount of traction along the ground and the maximum amount of surface area, so you can balance and coordinate and sort of feel the ground a lot more, right? So I guess a good starting point is to learn to actually separate the toes from that pointed position. That's where the maximum benefit will come from, right? So learning to get those muscles and those little ligaments out of that clustered sort of space that is the front of the shoe, and get more space in between the toes to allow for that movement. Absolutely. The issue then comes with, are there patterns in your movement where you're not actually using those toes in that spread out position? That's where, things like running and walking with those toes spread out are going to be absolutely essential, but you can't do it with those products, unfortunately. So, using them as a passive maybe approach, cool. But, at the end of the day, in terms of the hierarchy of importance of what you should be doing, you should be doing those, you should be practicing those with, your own muscles, that passive approach to just separating those toes without actually activating them. At the end of the day, it's not going to cause a big biomechanical change.
Yeah, it's it's like the thing I was saying before, the whole primal movement thing. It's like kind of a band-aid approach, or like I'll change this one thing and it'll fix all my problems. No, it won't. I do have a pair of them because I got them a little bit before I started FP anyway, so I wouldn't have known that they're probably not that good, but I think they're good, like you mentioned, as a passive approach to do walking around the home. If you can fit them in your shoes, do that and build up. Yep. But you have to do the gait cycle analysis and work on your biomechanics, because it's not going to change the way your knee moves in relation to your hip, or your shoulder in relation to your core. I think it's part of the solution, but it's a small part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Another question, we're sort of getting closer to the end, is we'll have to definitely do another episode, but this one, what's the deal with deadlifts? I never got into them when I was a weightlifter. I was only a weightlifter for like 1 or 2 years, and then I had some injury, but I understand they're very dysfunctional.
In terms of, deadlifts, deadlifts are promoted for, a couple reasons in the traditional sort of strength space. One of them being an attempt to teach someone how to hinge at their hips. So hinging at the hips basically means, bending at the hips. So if someone was to, say, sit down on a chair, that sort of movement. And the other sort of, there are a couple of reasons. Within the strength and conditioning space, another reason is they're promoted for producing, maximum force out of the ground. Because, if you look at high-level sprinters, they are correlated with producing high amounts of force from the ground. Another reason they're promoted is for their back stability. But if you look at all three of them, all of them are very lazy approaches to address that, right? So, for example, the hip hinging, commonly, like when people deadlift, they do deadlift quite heavy. And the issue with that primarily is you don't need 200 kilograms to teach someone how to drop their hips back. If they just sit on the chair, they'll gladly know how to hinge at their hips. You can load them in other ways. And the way we hinge our hips is not in two-footed fashion, which is how you do the deadlift usually, right? So you usually put your 2 feet together, grab the bar, lift, hinging at the hips on the way down, and then thrusting your hips forward on the way up, right? We did not evolve to produce that amount of force without both our feet together, And if you look at the way we're meant to do that, we're meant to move in a forwards and backwards fashion, right? So the problem with the deadlift is because you're only hinging up and down, that's a sagittal sort of movement. So that's only, up, down, really. There isn't any horizontal movement. There isn't any transverse movement, these planes of motion are basically the planes of motion responsible for moving in general. So transverse being rotational, and then say the frontal being, that lateral movement, your ability to move side to side, right? So the other reason people do deadlifts for, producing force into the ground. But that again is another reductionist sort of way of looking at human movement, because if you were to produce the maximum amount of force from the ground, you wouldn't need to do it just from a stationary position, right? You'd want to be doing it moving, just like you would do in the actual activity, right? I'll give you a perfect example.
Yeah.
Carl Dake, who's an awesome wrestler out of the US, who's going to the Olympics. I believe it's next year or the year after. Or it could even be this year, now that I'm thinking about it.
I think it's this year, 2020.
Yeah, it is. It is this year, yeah. Well, a lot of his training, he used to do a lot of deadlifts for his own wrestling training and all that. But the deadlifts were causing him all kinds of issues, primarily because they didn't actually help him with his dynamic movement. Because it was so stationary, they didn't actually help him with his ability to use that the same patterns of motion we're talking about, the hinging and the stability from the back, in actual, grappling someone and moving them 5 meters towards the left in the air. It doesn't actually, the same amount of forces can't be replicated because the muscles aren't moving in the fashion that they're going to be moving during the actual wrestle, if that makes sense. So what he was doing is using those hip hinging positions, but in a manner that he can move in different planes of motion as well. So using things like doesn't necessarily have to be light either. Using things like heavy medicine balls, moving them in rotational planes, moving them in frontal planes, replicating exactly what would happen if he was wrestling against another, man who's, 80 kilograms. I don't know his weight class. I think it's 80 kilograms. In different, it's unpredictable movement, and you can't replicate unpredictable movement in a predictable activity like the deadlifting. That's probably one of the main reasons. That's one of the main criticisms against it. But a lot of strength and conditioning coaches insist on it being the be all and end all. But I'd have to disagree on that.
I think another thing I'd like you to just kind of emphasize, I think, is that with things like deadlifts, back squat, all these things, like most people definitely have problems with their gait cycle, their biomechanics. If you've just by virtue of being part of modern society, you've probably got gait cycle issues. The deadlift and these exercises, they're going to compound any issues you're having in your body, aren't they? They're going to really entrench them into your fascia.
Yeah, I mean, look,
make it harder to fix them.
Absolutely. If we look at the most common, dysfunctions I see as a PT, and now, working in the gym I am, the most common dysfunctions people present with are, things like an anterior tilt or a kyphotic spine. And an anterior tilt, if you think about a swayed back, or an excess curvature in the lumbar spine, the lower back, and also rounded shoulders, right? So these things are already what they're doing by having those dysfunctions. Two things are immediately clear. One of them is an excess lumbar compression, so with that lower back sway. Another thing is that the rounded shoulders, that instability in the muscles of, for example, along the whole chain of the back, right? I'll give you an example. So more like really tight sort of front. If I can explain it in fascial terms, for example, imagine like you only used one part of the body, the opposite part of the body is going to suffer, right? And unfortunately, that's the way sort of human movement works. So say you already had those dysfunctions, and then you did a 200 kg deadlift, or even a 50 kg deadlift, right? And then you sort of loaded that spine, that lower back even more. Your discs are going to be even more compressed than what they already are. So we're getting massive amounts of people with sciatica pain, for example. The compression of the sciatica nerve. We're getting a lot of people having general disc degeneration and herniations, right? From already a young age. They're already in these high force, high risk movements with pretty little reward of sort of ingraining those already dysfunctions present in the body. So say they're going to go step on a treadmill. How are they going to get out of that lumbar compression when they just done, a deadlift that's probably 2 times their body weight, right? How are they going to get out of that lumbar compression just when they're already fighting against gravity and they're losing? If that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, it can't. It's already ingraining, as you said, the dysfunction is already present in the body. It doesn't take into account a lot of these exercises. They're recommended, but they don't even take into account let alone your strength levels, let alone the way your spine is sitting inside your back to start off with. So we get a lot of people, for example, going on finding programs online and going, oh, great, I've got the big five, I've got overhead presses, I've got deadlifts, I've got bench, I've got all this stuff, right? But hello, like, what if you had a dysfunctional pattern to start off with and you're just making it even worse? What if you already get pain to start off with, but you're not actually addressing the pain? You're not actually addressing your movement, which could be, at the end of the day, you're not even going to make gains in the in the program you're doing because you've already got a compromised body, already compromised structure.
Yeah. I did do many years ago one of those sort of online type programs. It was a basketball related one for improving vertical leap, and yeah, it's like you described. It's pretty much they make so many assumptions. I don't think those things can ever really be effective unless you have to see people in person. So we've been going for about 50 minutes. It's been a really good interview. Time to probably wrap it up, but where can people find you and get more information? If someone's in Sydney and they want to learn about a really great way to train, how can they contact you?
Yeah, so my Instagram is FP Seb Coello, so SEBCOELLO. I'm also, so I work out of the Plus Fitness, for example, in Sydney and Five Dock. And so if you can obviously contact me through there on Instagram. I'm also on the Functional Patterns Practitioners page. So if you're not in Sydney and you need a practitioner around your city or in your country, just visit, the functionalpatterns.com, and you can search on the practitioners tab up there, and you can sort of see where you're located and where the nearest practitioner is. And yeah, so those are my Instagram, probably my main sort of area. I'm also on Facebook with the same FP Seb Coello, and so you can find me there.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, and I think we're definitely going to have a few more of these.
Yeah, it'd be great to be back.
Sweet. Thank you.